What if I told you that almost everything you learned about American history in school was, well, let's call it made simpler? George Washington never cut down a cherry tree. The Founding Fathers didn't free enslaved people. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired woman who sewed clothes. And Columbus definitely didn't prove the earth was round. People had known that for about 2,000 years. History textbooks love a good story. They love heroes and bad guys, clear stories, and neat lessons. What they don't love is when things are complicated, confusing, or uncomfortable truths that make us question the stories we've built our country's identity around. So here's what we're doing tonight. We're going to take apart 100 lies you were probably told in history class. Not to ruin your childhood or make you think everything is bad, but because the truth is actually more interesting than the cleaned-up version. And maybe, just maybe, understanding where we actually came from helps us figure out where we're going. Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to history that doesn't treat you like you're silly, hit that subscribe button. Your future sleepy self will thank you. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about all the things your textbook left out on purpose, starting with a founding father and a tree that never existed. The cherry tree that never was. So, here's the thing about George Washington and that cherry tree. You know the story. Little George takes an axe to his father's special tree, then tells the truth, because he cannot tell a lie. Cute, inspiring, completely made up. A guy named Mason Locke Weems invented it in 1806 to sell more books about Washington after he died. Weems was basically the clickbait writer of his time, and that story was his viral hit. The real Washington? He lied all the time. Military tricks, fooling British spies, purposeful lies. He was actually pretty good at it. War requires lying. Leadership requires lying. But textbooks loved Weems' version because it taught kids about honesty while ignoring that survival often demands the opposite. The cherry tree became an American legend, carved into our group memory like an axe into a tree that never existed. And speaking of things we got wrong about Washington's mouth, the teeth no one wants to talk about. Those famous wooden fake teeth never happened. Washington's actual teeth were a nightmare made of hippo ivory, gold wire. And here's where it gets dark. Human teeth likely pulled from enslaved people he owned. Yes, really. The fake teeth caused him constant pain, clicked when he talked, and gave him that tight-lipped look you see in paintings. He wasn't calm and strong. He was in pain. The wooden teeth story probably started because ivory turns yellow and looks like wood, or maybe because the truth was too uncomfortable for textbooks. But Washington paid enslaved people on his plantation for teeth in 1784. Whether paid means real payment or forcing them under slavery is a question that makes the whole thing even darker. His tooth nightmares shaped how he looked, spoke, and led. Meanwhile, school books told us wooden teeth like it was a quirky fun fact. The cleaned-up version erased the human cost of his smile. But of course, that wasn't the only fiction we believed about the founders. The deist myth and the wall that wasn't. Your history teacher probably said the Founding Fathers were deists who wanted strict separation of church and state. Half true at best. Yes, Jefferson and Franklin learned deist, God as watchmaker, no miracles. But most founders were practicing Christians pushing Protestant control. They feared Catholicism, dismissed other religions, and assumed Christian morals would guide the government. Jefferson's Wall of Separation, letter to Danbury Baptists in 1802, got pulled from textbooks for decades because it was too non-religious for comfort. Meanwhile, state governments had religious tests for office into the 1830s. The First Amendment stopped a national church, not religious influence. It protected religion from the government, not the reverse. The modern understanding came later, shaped by court cases and cultural shifts. So when people argue about the Christian nation or secular founders, they're both cherry-picking, pun intended, from a messy, confusing historical record. And speaking of confusing things in the founding documents, we the people sounds like it means everyone until you read the fine print. The Constitution's people, in 1787 meant white male property owners. Women couldn't vote. Native Americans didn't count. Literally, they were left out of population counts unless they paid taxes. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, boosting Southern power without giving them humanity or rights. So the document held up as democracy's blueprint was actually a rulebook for the wealthy few. About 6% of the population could participate. The Electoral College wasn't about fairness. It was a compromise to give slaveholding states extra power. The Senate overrepresented small states by design. Even the House required property requirements in many states. Universal voting took nearly 2 centuries of amendments, court battles, and actual wars. Calling it a perfect democracy blueprint is like calling a rough draft a masterpiece. It was a starting point, one that needed massive, bloody changes. But before we had a constitution, we had a midnight ride that wasn't quite what you learned. The ride Paul Revere didn't take alone. Paul Revere gets all the credit thanks to Longfellow's 1861 poem, but the real story is Messier. He didn't ride alone. William Dawes and Samuel Prescott rode too. He didn't yell, "The British are coming," because everyone was British. He whispered, "The regulars are out," to avoid being caught. He never made it to Concord. He got captured by a British patrol, questioned, and his horse was taken. Prescott actually finished the ride, but Longfellow needed a hero with a name that rhymed. So Revere became the legend. The midnight ride happened, but it was a team effort, not a solo race. History loves individuals more than committees. So Revere got the poem, the fame, and the elementary school plays. Dawes and Prescott got footnotes. Meanwhile, the ride itself wasn't even the main event. It was an advance warning before Lexington and Concord kicked off the war. But speaking of revolutionary myths that got simplified for children's books, Betsy Ross and the flag that maybe wasn't hers. Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag is a lovely story with zero proof. Her grandson claimed it in 1870, nearly a century after it supposedly happened, with no documents, no witnesses, and no stories from that time. Historians think a Philadelphia upholsterer probably made early flags, and Ross ran an upholstery business, so maybe. But saying the first flag was hers specifically is family legend turned into fact. The Stars and Stripes design came from the Continental Congress in 1777, and multiple seamstresses likely made versions. Yet Ross became the symbol, probably because Americans in the 1800s wanted a wholesome motherly figure attached to the flag's beginning. She fit the story. Widowed, hardworking, Quaker, connected to Washington through church. Truth didn't matter as much as the story's usefulness. Ross became a fixture in classrooms, paintings, and patriotic stuff. The flag's real creator? Unknown, lost to history, replaced by a comfortable fiction. But if we're talking about revolutionary myths, the Boston Tea Party deserves a closer look. The Tea Party that was actually vandalism. The Boston Tea Party gets taught as a heroic protest, but it was criminal destruction of private property. December 1773, about 60 men, some disguised as Mohawks to hide their identities and shift blame, boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, worth roughly $18,000 or about $1.7 million today. It wasn't the British government's tea. It was the East India Company's, and smugglers and merchants lost profits. The disguises weren't showing support for Native Americans. They were tools to stay anonymous. The British responded with the Intolerable Acts, which made moderates angry and pushed colonies toward war. So yes, it was a catalyst, but also vandalism that made tensions worse. History cleaned it up into a neat protest instead of admitting its chaotic, destructive reality. The participants knew they were breaking the law. That's why they wore disguises. But textbooks turned it into pageantry, complete with tricorn hats and revolutionary excitement. Meanwhile, another famous revolutionary story needs some voltage fact-checking. Franklin's kite and the lightning he didn't discover. Benjamin Franklin didn't discover electricity. He proved lightning was electrical. Big difference. June 1752, he flew a kite in a thunderstorm with a key attached, drawing a spark. Insanely dangerous. Could have killed him. But French scientist Thomas-François Dalibard did the experiment first in May, following Franklin's instructions. Franklin's genius was recognizing lightning's nature and inventing the lightning rod, which saved countless buildings. But the kite story became folklore, exaggerated, illustrated, turned into a lone genius moment. In reality, electricity was studied by others before him. Stephen Gray, Charles Dufay, and more. Franklin contributed crucial insights, But science is teamwork, not heroic solo acts. Still, the image of Franklin in a storm, key sparking, became famous. It's dramatic. It's visual. It's mostly true, but missing context. History loves stories where one person changes everything. Actual science is slower, messier, built on earlier work. But speaking of convenient timing and historical poetry, the 4th of July deaths felt like fate. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on July 4, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration. Spooky, right? Except it's just coincidence dressed up as destiny. Adams's last words were supposedly, "Jefferson survives." But Jefferson had actually died hours earlier at Monticello. They didn't know about each other's deaths because communication was slow. The cosmic poetry is real, but the meaning we assign is our imagination. They were old men who had lived full lives, made up after a bitter political rivalry, and happened to die on the same symbolically loaded day. Humans love patterns, so this became a meant-to-be story. But 5 other signers also died on July 4th across different years. Monroe died July 4th, 1831. Coincidence piles up with enough people and time. The Jefferson-Adams timing is haunting and beautiful, but it's not evidence of divine plan, just death and math. Still, speaking of the Declaration itself, its signing date is also not what you think. The 4th, that wasn't the 4th. The Declaration of Independence wasn't signed on July 4th, 1776. Congress voted for independence on July 2nd. The Declaration was approved on the 4th, but the fancy formal copy wasn't signed until August 2nd. Most delegates signed even later, some in November. So what are we celebrating on July 4th? The approval of the text, not the signing. John Adams thought July 2nd would be the day remembered, writing to his wife that it would be celebrated with parties and parades. He was off for 2 days. The 4th stuck because it was on the document's header and became the date associated with the announcement. But the actual "we're independent now" decision happened July 2nd. The signing ceremony was spread out and, frankly, boring. History squeezed it into one dramatic moment because that's easier to remember. Nobody wants to celebrate gradual signing throughout late summer. So we picked the 4th, and here we are. But the unified front those signers supposedly represented was also exaggerated. The founders who hated each other. The Founding Fathers weren't a peaceful band of visionaries. They were bitterly divided. Hamilton and Jefferson hated each other. Hamilton called Jefferson a coward. Jefferson called Hamilton a monarchist. Their groups nearly tore the young nation apart. Hamilton and Burr's rivalry ended in a duel that killed Hamilton in 1804. Adams and Jefferson didn't speak for years after the nasty election of 1800. Slavery split them. Some owned enslaved people and defended it. Others opposed it but did nothing. The Constitutional Convention almost collapsed multiple times over representation, slavery, and federal power. They compromised out of necessity, not unity. The image of them as united patriots is after the Revolution myth-making. They were flawed, ambitious, confusing men who happened to be in the same room at the right time. Some were brilliant, some were lucky. All were human. And the cause they supposedly united around? Not quite universal. The revolution that left out most people. The Revolutionary War gets sold as a fight for liberty and equality, but most people were left out. Enslaved people fought on both sides. The British promised freedom if they fled their masters, and thousands did. The Continental Army also had black soldiers, but many states banned them, and after the war freedom promises were broken. Women couldn't vote or own property, but they ran farms, businesses, and spy networks while men fought. Native Americans were caught in the middle, and most sided with the British because colonists kept stealing their land. After the war, natives were pushed further west. Poor white men did the dying while wealthy landowners led and profited. Taxes to fund the war hit the poor hardest. The liberty fought for was mainly economic. Freedom from British trade restrictions and taxes, not universal human rights. That came later, unevenly, after generations of struggle. The revolution was a step, not a finish line. But one of its most famous images also needs context. Crossing the Delaware wasn't a solo row. That famous painting of Washington standing in a boat crossing the Delaware? Dramatic but misleading. December 25, 1776, Washington led about 2,400 troops across in a fleet of roughly 30 boats during a brutal winter storm. The river was full of ice chunks. Men rowed for hours in freezing conditions. It wasn't a calm, heroic glide. It was chaotic and desperate. The surprise attack on Trenton worked, capturing Hessian forces and reviving the Continental cause after a string of losses. But it was a team effort involving hundreds of freezing, exhausted soldiers, not Washington heroically steering alone. The painting by Emanuel Leutze in 1851 took liberties. Wrong flag, wrong boat style, wrong pose. Art chose inspiration over accuracy. Still, the crossing was genuinely important. A calculated risk that paid off. But history simplified it into one man in a boat because that's the image that sticks. And speaking of things the Constitution simplified by pushing them to the future, the slavery compromise that poisoned everything. The Constitution didn't end slavery. Debates. It made them worse. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, giving Southern states more power in Congress and the Electoral College without giving those people rights. It was pure political math. Anti-slavery delegates couldn't get abolition through. Pro-slavery delegates wouldn't join without protections. So they wrote slavery into the framework and agreed not to ban the slave trade until 1808. The founders knew it was evil. Some called it so. But they chose union over justice. They pushed the problem to future generations, assuming it would solve itself somehow. Didn't. It festered for 7 decades until the Civil War killed 600,000 people and forced the issue. The compromise was cowardice dressed as smart thinking. And its legacy poisoned American politics for centuries. Textbooks call it a necessary compromise. Necessary for whom? Not the enslaved. But another founder's origin story also got simplified into myth. Hamilton wasn't quite the rags-to-riches immigrant. Alexander Hamilton's story is interesting, but it's been turned into legend. Yes, he was born out of wedlock in the Caribbean and orphaned young. But he wasn't dirt poor. His mother's family had some money, and community members paid for his education, recognizing his brilliance. He arrived in New York in 1772 with connections and resources. The poor immigrant orphan story is exaggerated, partly by Hamilton himself, who used it for political advantage, and partly by biographers who loved the bootstrap story. He was an immigrant, yes, and faced obstacles. But he also had privileges. White, male, educated, charming, and well-connected. His rise was impressive, but not the miracle it's sold as. The rags-to-riches myth fits American ideology better than smart, ambitious guy with some help made it big. Both are true, but one gets emphasized. Meanwhile, the document he helped defend wasn't originally complete. The Constitution didn't include the Bill of Rights initially. The Federalists thought it was unnecessary. Rights were implied. Anti-Federalists disagreed, threatening not to approve unless individual protections were clear. So James Madison wrote amendments in 1789, and the first 10 were approved by 1791. It wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate Federalist position that rights didn't need listing because the government only had listed powers. But states wanted guarantees. The Bill of Rights was a political compromise to get the Constitution approved, not a visionary addition. And even then, those rights applied unevenly. Free speech didn't protect protesters. See the Sedition Act of 1798. The Second Amendment's militia clause got reinterpreted. And rights didn't extend to enslaved people or women. The Bill of Rights was foundational, yes, but also incomplete and selectively enforced. Its power grew through interpretation and struggle. But another mythologized moment in the Revolution also deserves scrutiny. Valley Forge wasn't just suffering. Valley Forge in winter 1777-78 was brutal. Cold, starvation, disease. About 2,000 soldiers died, mostly from typhus and typhoid, not freezing. But it wasn't pure misery. Baron von Steuben arrived and drilled the Continental Army into a professional fighting force, teaching tactics and discipline. Supplies eventually came through from France and helpful merchants. It was a turning point, not just an endurance test. The mythologized version focuses on Washington's suffering troops, barefoot in snow, which did happen, but misses that Valley Forge was also where the army became competent. Von Steuben's training manual became standard. Morale improved. They came out stronger. History loves the suffering to triumph story. So Valley Forge became a symbol of American toughness. True but incomplete. The conditions were horrible, but the outcome was strategic. Survival mattered, but so did the change. And speaking of changes that get credited to one person, Jefferson didn't write the Declaration alone. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, but he didn't write it by himself. The Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5: Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson did the initial draft. Then Adams and Franklin edited it. Congress then debated and revised it further, cutting about a quarter of Jefferson's original text, including a passage blaming King George for slavery. Southern delegates wouldn't allow it. So the Declaration was teamwork, negotiated and politically compromised. Jefferson got credit because he held the pen, but the ideas were Enlightenment philosophy taken from Locke, Montesquieu, and others. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was Jefferson's phrasing, but the concept wasn't original. Textbooks say Jefferson wrote the Declaration because it's simpler than a committee drafted, debated, and revised a document combining modern political theory. But the truth is messier, and the ripple effects of that declaration also got complicated. The revolution that terrified the founders. The American Revolution supposedly inspired global freedom movements, which is partly true. But the French Revolution in 1789 turned into the terror, guillotining thousands, and American founders were horrified. They supported French liberty in theory but feared its radicalism in practice. Then Haiti's slave revolt in 1791 really scared them. Enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose up, fought a brutal war, and established the first Black Republic in 1804. White Americans, including Jefferson, were terrified of the example. Jefferson privately hoped Haiti would fail. Southern states banned Haitian refugees, fearing they'd inspire American slave revolts. The revolution's message, freedom, equality, resistance to tyranny, was supposed to be for white colonists, not enslaved people or foreign radicals. When others took it literally, the founders backed away. The inspiring words had limits, and those limits were racial, economic, and self-interested. But even Washington's presidency started with a myth. Washington's unanimous election wasn't quite. George Washington was unanimously elected, but with catches. He was reluctant and had to be convinced to run. When the Electoral College voted in 1789, every elector cast one vote for Washington, making him president. But electors cast 2 votes each, and the second votes went to various candidates. John Adams got the second most and became vice president, which he hated. The system assumed the runner-up would be a worthy backup, but it created awkward situations. Washington's unanimity wasn't universal love. It was a lack of good alternatives and fear of disunity. He was the only person everyone trusted not to become a tyrant, which is less inspiring than everyone adored him. He didn't want the job. He took it out of duty. And the Electoral College system that chose him, designed to prevent direct democracy, not celebrate it. But that's a pattern we'll keep seeing. The myths simplify. The truth is complicated. The expedition wasn't a solo discovery. Lewis and Clark get all the credit for discovering the West, but they had considerable help that textbooks minimize. Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, guided them, negotiated with tribes, and kept them from starving. York, William Clark's enslaved man, hunted, scouted, and impressed native communities who had never seen a black man before. Yet he remained enslaved after the expedition. Clark didn't free him for another decade, maybe longer. The discovery story also ignores that Native Americans already lived there, had established trade routes, and knew the land intimately. Lewis and Clark followed existing trails, relied on native maps and guides, and would have died without indigenous help. Their journals are valuable, sure, but calling it a discovery erases the people who already lived on and understood the land. The expedition was a military scouting mission funded by Jefferson to claim territory and check resources, not a brave journey into the unknown. It was empire building with better PR. And speaking of presidential policies that sounded noble but served empire building, the Monroe Doctrine that protected American interests, not independence. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 gets taught as a protective shield for Latin American independence movements, warning European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Noble, right? Except it was ignored by Europe and served U.S. imperial ambitions more than Latin American freedom. President James Monroe declared the Americas off-limits to European colonization, but the U.S. had no military to enforce it. Britain's navy actually did the protecting because it helped British trade. Meanwhile, the doctrine said nothing about U.S. intervention, which became the real problem. Later presidents used Monroe to justify American meddling, occupations, and resource stealing across Latin America. It wasn't about defending struggling republics. It was about securing a sphere of influence. The doctrine didn't stop Spain from keeping Cuba until 1898 or prevent European debt collection in Venezuela. But it did give the U.S. moral cover for interventions in Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The doctrine was less hands off our neighbors, and more this hemisphere is ours to control. And before Monroe, another war reshaped the young nation's identity. The War of 1812 gets framed as a second victory over Britain, a triumphant defense of American freedom. Except it was a stalemate that nearly destroyed the country. The U.S. invaded Canada and failed. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. Dolly Madison had to rescue George Washington's portrait before fleeing. The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, which basically reset everything to pre-war status. No territory changed hands. The issues that sparked the war, impressment of American sailors, trade restrictions, weren't even resolved in the treaty. They just became irrelevant after Napoleon's defeat in Europe. Native American confederacies led by Tecumseh allied with Britain and lost catastrophically. The war destroyed native power in the Northwest Territory, opening millions of acres to white settlement. So yes, Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans 2 weeks after the treaty was signed because news traveled slowly, and that became the mythologized victory. But the war itself? A costly, bloody mess that benefited land speculators and devastated indigenous nations. And speaking of Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, the people's champion who owned 150 humans. Andrew Jackson is sold as the rough frontier populist who fought for the common man against elites. He expanded voting rights for white men and challenged the Bank of the United States, which he saw as corrupt. Fair enough. But Jackson also owned around 150 enslaved people at his plantation, the Hermitage, and brutally enforced their bondage. He bought, sold, and hunted down runaways, placing newspaper ads offering rewards for their capture. His democracy didn't extend to black people, Native Americans, or women. And then there's the Trail of Tears. Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people from their ancestral lands in the southeast to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The forced marches killed over 4,000 Cherokee alone from disease, starvation, and exposure. The Supreme Court ruled against Georgia's seizure of Cherokee land in Worcester versus Georgia, but Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," and ignored the ruling. He was a war hero, yes, but also a slaveholder and architect of genocide. The common man he championed was specifically white, male, and land-hungry. And that land hunger had a name and an ideology. Manifest Destiny, the divine mission that was just racist expansion. Manifest Destiny sounds grand. America's God-given right to expand from coast to coast, spreading democracy and civilization. Journalist John O'Sullivan coined the phrase in 1845, but the idea was older. White Americans believed they were destined to control the continent. In practice, it meant displacing over 100,000 Native Americans through broken treaties, forced removals, and outright violence. It meant war with Mexico to seize Texas, California, and the Southwest. It meant justifying terrible acts with fake religious talk and racial superiority. The phrase itself is propaganda. Destiny implies it had to happen. Manifest implies it's obvious. Both erase the choice and violence involved. Native nations weren't obstacles to progress. They were independent peoples with their own histories, governments, and land rights. But manifest destiny framed them as roadblocks to white expansion. It also extended slavery westward, intensifying the national crisis that led to civil war. The ideology didn't end at the Pacific either. It justified seizing Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico later. Manifest destiny wasn't divine. It was empire-building dressed in religious language. But before the philosophy had a name, Jefferson made a land deal that embodied it. The Louisiana Purchase that broke Jefferson's own rules. Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase in 1803 is praised as a brilliant expansion, doubling the nation's size for $15 million, about 4 cents an acre. And yes, it was strategically huge. But it was also unconstitutional by Jefferson's own strict interpretation. The Constitution didn't clearly give the president power to acquire territory. Jefferson, who had spent years arguing for limited federal power, suddenly ignored his principles when Napoleon offered the deal. He knew it was legally shaky, even drafted an amendment to authorize it, then abandoned that when he feared delay would kill the deal. So he just did it and asked Congress to approve the money. Passed, but the hypocrisy was obvious. The purchase also doubled the potential territory for slavery, intensifying sectional tensions. It displaced countless native nations who weren't asked. And France didn't really own the land, native peoples did. So the sale was Europeans trading stolen property. The purchase is taught as visionary statesmanship, but it was opportunistic rule-breaking that set examples for executive overreach and imperial expansion. Speaking of expansion through questionable means, Polk's war with Mexico didn't start. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 gets framed as defensive. Mexico attacked American troops, so we fought back. Except President James K. Polk deliberately provoked it. He wanted California and the Southwest, so he sent troops into disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, knowing Mexico claimed it. When Mexican forces engaged, Polk told Congress Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil, which was technically disputed soil. The war was a land grab dressed as self-defense. The U.S. won, seized half of Mexico's territory, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, and paid $15 million in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk's justification with his spot resolutions, demanding to know the exact spot where American blood was shed. Polk ignored him. The war was popular with expansionists, opposed by abolitionists who saw it as a scheme to spread slavery westward. Ulysses S. Grant later called it one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. But history loves winners, so it became expansion, not conquest. And that conquered land soon drew desperate fortune seekers. The gold rush that wasn't equal opportunity. The California gold rush of 1849 gets romanticized as a democratic scramble where anyone could strike it rich. In reality, it was violent, racist, and devastating for non-white people. Chinese immigrants flocked to California but faced the foreign miners' tax. $20 a month when most miners earned less, and brutal violence. Mobs attacked Chinese mining camps, burned homes, and murdered miners with no punishment. Native Californians had it worse. The gold rush brought diseases that killed thousands. White miners enslaved native people to work claims, and California's state government funded militia campaigns that were basically genocides. The native population dropped from around 150,000 in 1848 to around 30,000 by 1870. The myth of the rugged individual panning for gold erases the industrial mining operations that quickly took over, the environmental destruction from hydraulic mining, and the racial hierarchies enforced through violence. Some got rich, mostly early arrivals and merchants selling supplies. During a gold rush, sell shovels. But the rush wasn't a level playing field. It was a racial and economic battlefield. And while fortunes rose and fell out west, back east, a legal case was making things worse. Dred Scott, the case that didn't free anyone. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 is often misunderstood as a step toward freedom. It was the opposite. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for freedom because his enslaver took him to free territories. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that black people, enslaved or free, weren't citizens and had no right to sue. The decision declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, opening all territories to slavery. It inflamed abolitionists, emboldened slaveholders, and pushed the nation toward war. Scott himself was freed by his new owner shortly after, then died within a year. The ruling wasn't overturned until the 14th Amendment in 1868. So Dred Scott didn't free slaves. It made slavery stronger legally and morally outraged enough people to speed up the conflict. Taney thought he was settling the issue. Instead, he poured gasoline on it. The case is a landmark, but for infamy, not justice. Meanwhile, another landmark, this time in literature, also gets misunderstood. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book that moved millions but freed none. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, was a cultural earthquake. It sold 300,000 copies in the first year, was adapted into plays, and moved Northern readers to tears over slavery's brutality. Lincoln supposedly greeted Stowe during the Civil War by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Great story, probably made up. The book didn't free anyone. It was based on real accounts from formerly enslaved people and abolitionists, and Stowe's description of slavery's horrors was rooted in truth. Families torn apart, violence, dehumanization. But it also reinforced racist stereotypes. Uncle Tom became a symbol of passivity. Topsy, a caricature of black childhood. The novel influenced public opinion, yes. But changing minds doesn't equal changing laws or freeing people. The Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment did that through war and politics, not literature. Stowe's work mattered, but it was a catalyst, not a solution. And before the war came, the Kansas Territory became a preview of the violence to come. Bleeding Kansas, the not-so-minor skirmish. Bleeding Kansas sounds like a footnote, a preview to the Civil War. But it was a brutal guerrilla conflict from 1854 to 1861 that killed over 200 people and terrorized thousands more. The Kansas-Nebraska Act let settlers vote on whether to allow slavery, so pro- and anti-slavery forces flooded the territory. Elections were rigged, towns were attacked, and militias roamed, murdering opponents. John Brown led a raid at Pottawatomie Creek, hacking 5 pro-slavery settlers to death with swords in revenge for attacks on abolitionist towns. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed in to stuff ballot boxes and burned free state settlements like Lawrence. The violence was personal and political. Neighbors killing neighbors over whether Kansas would be slave or free. It was a preview of the Civil War's intensity, and it proved that compromise was dead. The phrase "bleeding Kansas" undersells the horror. It was a war before the war. And when the National War finally came, its causes were more complicated than textbooks admit. Abraham Lincoln didn't start the Civil War to free enslaved people. He started it to preserve the Union. In his first inaugural address in March 1861, he said he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, only stopping its expansion. In August 1862, he wrote to Horace Greeley, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." Emancipation became a war aimed strategically, to weaken the Confederacy economically and morally, and to prevent European recognition of the South. The Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 was a military measure as much as a moral one. Lincoln's personal views evolved, and by war's end he supported the 13th Amendment. But framing the war as a righteous crusade against slavery from day one is inaccurate. It was about preserving federal authority, and emancipation became the tool to do it. The cause was just, but the motivations were mixed. And even the war's most famous battle isn't quite the turning point we think. Gettysburg, the turning point that shared the spotlight. Gettysburg in July 1863 is taught as the Civil War's decisive turning point. Lee's invasion stopped, the Confederacy broken, the war basically won. Except the war dragged on for nearly 2 more years and claimed hundreds of thousands more lives. And Gettysburg wasn't even the only major Union victory that week. Vicksburg fell on July 4th, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in half. Strategically, Vicksburg mattered as much or more. Grant's campaign there was brilliantly done. Meade's defense at Gettysburg, while crucial, let Lee escape back to Virginia instead of destroying his army. Lincoln was furious about that. Gettysburg became mythologized partly because of Lincoln's address 4 months later. 272 words redefining the war as a struggle for equality and democracy. The speech made Gettysburg symbolically central. The battle mattered absolutely, but calling it the single turning point oversimplifies. Vicksburg, Antietam, Atlanta, Sherman's March, all were pivotal too. Wars don't turn on single battles. But one document from the war does stand out, even if it's widely misunderstood. The Emancipation Proclamation that freed almost no one immediately. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued January 1, 1863, is taught as the moment Lincoln freed the enslaved. Except it only applied to Confederate-held territory, places the Union didn't control. Enslaved people in Union border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri remained enslaved. So did those in occupied areas of the Confederacy like New Orleans and parts of Virginia. Lincoln used his war powers to declare Confederate slaves free as a military measure to destabilize the South. It was a brilliant strategy, morally right, but limited in immediate effect. Freedom came as Union troops advanced and enslaved people fled to Union lines, or as they liberated themselves by escaping. The 13th Amendment in December 1865 actually abolished slavery everywhere. The proclamation mattered enormously. It changed the war's moral character, allowed black soldiers to enlist formally, and signaled that slavery's end was coming. But it didn't free everyone instantly. History loves clean stories. Reality is messier. And the man who killed Lincoln also operated in a messier reality than the lone gunman story suggests. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin who didn't act alone. John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, and died 12 days later in a Virginia barn. Textbooks often frame him as a lone fanatic, but Booth was part of a larger conspiracy involving at least 8 co-conspirators. The plot included simultaneous attacks. Lewis Powell stabbed Secretary of State William Seward, seriously wounding him. George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson but chickened out. The goal was to destroy the Union government's leadership. Booth's co-conspirators were tried by a military court. 4 were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government. 3 got life sentences. 1 got 6 years. Booth himself kept a diary detailing his motives, defending the Confederacy and slavery. Lincoln suspected broader plots. His security was minimal by modern standards. Whether more conspirators existed beyond the 8 charged remains debated, but it wasn't a lone gunman scenario. It was organized political terrorism. And the aftermath of Lincoln's death shaped the next decade disastrously. Reconstruction sabotaged from within. Reconstruction gets taught as a noble effort ruined by stubborn Southern resistance. That's part of it, but Northern racism and federal abandonment were just as guilty. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, became president and immediately undermined Reconstruction. He pardoned former Confederates, opposed black voting rights, and clashed with Congress. Radical Republicans in Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendments and the Reconstruction Acts, enforcing civil rights and black voting with federal troops. For a brief period, black men voted, held office, and built schools and communities. Then Northern political will collapsed. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction, withdrawing federal troops in exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes's presidency. Southern states immediately put in place black codes and Jim Crow laws. The Supreme Court gutted the 14th Amendment in cases like the Slaughterhouse cases and U.S. v. Cruikshank, ruling that the amendment didn't protect individuals from state violence. Reconstruction didn't fail because of Southern resistance alone. It was deliberately abandoned by the North, which chose reunion over justice. And the amendment meant to guarantee equality was ignored for a century. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. and promised equal protection under law. Revolutionary on paper. In practice, states ignored it for a century. The Supreme Court weakened it almost immediately. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 said, "Separate but equal was constitutional, blessing segregation." The civil rights cases of 1883 ruled the amendment didn't apply to private discrimination, only state action, gutting the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Southern states put in place Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses to keep black voters from voting. Lynchings terrorized black communities with no punishment. The amendment existed, but enforcement didn't. It took the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, new federal laws, and Supreme Court reversals to finally give the 14th Amendment teeth. Brown versus Board in 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These forced the country to honor the amendment's promise. So yes, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship, but actually enjoying it took another century of struggle. Speaking of presidents whose legacies were distorted, Grant, the drunk who was actually honest. Ulysses S. Grant's presidency gets dismissed as corrupt and incompetent, the general who couldn't govern. He did drink, struggled with alcoholism, especially during lonely military postings, but was often sober during crucial moments, including most of his presidency. The drunk Grant story was made bigger by lost cause mythology that needed to diminish the Union's hero. Grant's administration did have scandals, the whiskey ring, the credit mobilier affair. But Grant himself wasn't corrupt. He trusted people he shouldn't have, appointed friends who betrayed him, and was politically naive. But he also fought fiercely for civil rights. He signed the Enforcement Acts, used federal troops to crush the Ku Klux Klan, and supported black voting rights more aggressively than any president until the 20th century. He wasn't a great president, but he was honest and tried to protect the gains of Reconstruction. History judged him harshly, partly because the North wanted to move on from Reconstruction and reunite with the South, which required forgetting Grant's civil rights record. The corrupt drunk story stuck because it was convenient, and the era he presided over also got a misleading nickname: the Gilded Age that was more tarnished than gold. The Gilded Age, roughly 1870 to 1900, gets its name from Mark Twain's novel mocking the era's fake glitter over deep corruption. It was a time of rapid industrialization, technological progress, and staggering inequality. Robber barons like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt accumulated obscene wealth while workers labored in dangerous conditions for starvation wages. By 1890, the wealthiest 1% owned over 51% of the nation's wealth. Strikes were broken with violence. Pinkerton's state militias, federal troops. The Homestead Strike of 1892, the Pullman Strike of 1894, crushed. Child labor was rampant. Cities were overcrowded, unsanitary, and full of disease. Political machines like Tammany Hall ran on corruption and favoritism. Yes, railroads were built, steel mills churned, cities grew. But the human cost was staggering. The age wasn't golden. It was brutal, exploitative, and designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. Progress, sure. But for whom? The answer determined the next century's battles. Edison's light bulb and the 23 people he doesn't thank. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb. He perfected it for mass production. At least 23 inventors before him created working electric lights, including Humphrey Davy, Warren de la Rue, and Joseph Swan. Swan actually demonstrated a working bulb in 1878, a year before Edison's. But Edison had something better. A team of engineers at Menlo Park. Serious funding and ruthless business tactics. His real genius was making bulbs practical, long-lasting filaments, effective vacuums, scalable manufacturing, and an entire electrical distribution system to power them. He didn't work alone in a lab. He ran an invention factory with dozens of employees doing the grunt work. Edison got the patents and the credit. His competitors got lawsuits. He merged with Swan's company in Britain to avoid losing in court. The lone genius myth persists because it's simpler than collaborative engineering team funded by venture capital systematically improving existing technology. Edison was brilliant at commercialization and self-promotion. Invention, that was more crowded. And speaking of contested firsts in American innovation, the Wright brothers and the flight that maybe wasn't first. The Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903, is American gospel. Except Gustav Whitehead, a German immigrant in Connecticut, may have flown a powered aircraft in August 1901, 2 years earlier. Witnesses reported it. Newspapers covered it. But the evidence is disputed. No photographs survived. Records are unclear. And the Wrights' careful documentation won the story. The Wrights were also fierce about patents, suing competitors into oblivion and slowing American aviation development for years. Whether Whitehead truly flew first remains debated among historians, but the Wrights' claim isn't as uncontested as textbooks suggest. What's certain? They built a practical, controllable airplane and deserve enormous credit. But first is complicated. Aviation had many pioneers: Otto Lilienthal, Samuel Langley, Octave Chanute, each contributing pieces. The Wrights combined, improved, and most importantly, documented and patented aggressively. History loves clear firsts. Reality is messier. And speaking of presidents who get simplified into heroic firsts, Teddy Roosevelt, the trustbuster who had help. Theodore Roosevelt's reputation as the great trustbuster implies he single-handedly took on corporate monopolies. Not quite. He inherited the Northern Securities antitrust case from William McKinley's administration and saw it through. Yes, Roosevelt filed over 40 antitrust suits and spoke boldly about corporate power, but progressives in Congress and muckraking journalists did much of the pushing. Roosevelt was more bark than bite. He believed in regulating big business, not dismantling it. He distinguished between good and bad trusts, which mostly meant he tolerated the ones that cooperated with him. His successor, William Howard Taft, actually filed more antitrust cases. Roosevelt's real skill was publicity. He understood how to use the presidency as a bully pulpit and made trust-busting theatrically visible. He was genuinely progressive for his time on conservation and labor, but calling him a solo crusader oversells it. He worked within a broader progressive movement that included unions, reformers, and journalists exposing corporate abuses. Still, his image as the bold reformer stuck. And speaking of bold images masking uncomfortable truths, the Titanic's iceberg and the corners that were cut. The Titanic hit an iceberg on April 14, 1912, and sank, killing over 1,500 people. But blaming the iceberg alone ignores human decisions. The ship was speeding through ice-worn waters to make headlines with a fast maiden voyage. Lookouts had no binoculars. They'd been locked in a storage room, and the keyholder left the ship before departure. The rivets holding the hull plates were substandard wrought iron in crucial areas, not steel because builders cut costs. Lifeboats, only enough for half the passengers because more would clutter the deck and ruin the look. Regulations didn't require more. The unsinkable marketing was arrogance. Watertight compartments only went partway up, so water spilled over as the bow sank. Nearby ships ignored distress flares, thinking they were celebratory. The iceberg was the catalyst, but arrogance, cost-cutting, and weak regulations were the real culprits. Calling it an unavoidable tragedy erases the choices that made it inevitable. And speaking of avoidable tragedies sold as noble causes, the war to end all wars that ended nothing. World War I was sold as the war to end all wars, a righteous crusade for democracy. In reality, it was imperial powers squabbling over territory, and American entry in 1917 was heavily influenced by banks that had loaned billions to Britain and France and needed them to win so they'd get repaid. Woodrow Wilson campaigned in 1916 on keeping America out, then reversed course. The war killed 17 million people, accomplished little strategically, and the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany so harshly it fueled resentment that led directly to World War II. The war didn't end wars. Planted seeds for worse ones. Chemical weapons, trench warfare, and industrial slaughter became the new normal. The League of Nations, Wilson's grand vision, failed because the U.S. Senate refused to join. Soldiers came home traumatized, broken, and forgotten. The war to end all wars rhetoric was propaganda to justify the unjustifiable. It ended nothing and started everything that followed. And Wilson himself was no hero either. Wilson, the progressive who segregated the government. Woodrow Wilson gets credit for progressivism, antitrust laws, the Federal Reserve, labor reforms. But he was also a virulent racist who resegregated the federal workforce. Black employees who'd worked alongside whites under previous administrations were suddenly separated, demoted, or fired. Wilson screened The Birth of a Nation at the White House, a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan. He opposed women's suffrage for years, only supporting the 19th Amendment when political pressure became unbearable. Suffragists picketed the White House. He had them arrested and force-fed in jail during hunger strikes. His 14 points sounded idealistic, but he ignored self-determination for colonized peoples at Versailles. Wilson believed in democracy for white men and paternalistic control for everyone else. His progressive legacy is real, but so is his deep structural racism. Textbooks soften him into a visionary. The truth is more uncomfortable. And the next decade's grand social experiment was equally uncomfortable in practice. Prohibition, the law that killed 10,000 people. Prohibition, enforced by the 18th Amendment from 1920 to 1933, was supposed to reduce crime, corruption, and social ills caused by alcohol. It did the opposite. Organized crime exploded. Al Capone and other mobsters made fortunes bootlegging. Speakeasies spread. Corruption soared as cops and politicians took bribes. And then there's the poisoning. The government, frustrated that industrial alcohol was being redistributed as drinking alcohol, ordered it deliberately poisoned with methanol and other toxins. Over 10,000 people died from poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. The policy didn't stop drinking. It made it more dangerous and enriched criminals. Prohibition was repealed in 1933 because it was a complete disaster. The lesson: banning something people want creates black markets, not compliance. Apparently it didn't stick, given later drug wars. But the myth persists that Prohibition was a noble failure, not a deadly policy choice that killed thousands. Speaking of myths that oversimplified complex cultural battles, the Scopes trial, the evolution victory that wasn't. The Scopes monkey trial of 1925 is taught as a triumph of science over ignorance. John Scopes, a Tennessee teacher, was prosecuted for teaching evolution. Clarence Darrow defended him. William Jennings Bryan prosecuted. Darrow humiliated Bryan on the stand, exposing biblical contradictions. Scopes was convicted and fined $100. But the trial was a PR stunt. Scopes volunteered to be arrested to challenge the law. The conviction was overturned on a technicality, leaving the anti-evolution law intact. And here's the kicker: creationism kept being taught in schools for decades afterward. The trial didn't change Tennessee law or Southern education. It became a cultural symbol, but its immediate impact was minimal. The real shift came much later. Epperson versus Arkansas in 1968 finally struck down anti-evolution laws. The Scopes trial was theater, not a turning point. It made great headlines and had a bad history. But another headline-grabbing event actually did change history, though not the way textbooks claim. The stock market crash that didn't cause the Depression alone. The stock market crash of October 1929 is treated as the Depression's singular cause. It was a trigger, not the root. The economy was already fragile. Massive debt, wealth inequality, overproduction, weak banks, and the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which devastated international trade. Farmers had been struggling since World War I ended and demand collapsed. Banks were unregulated and failing. The crash exposed underlying rot but didn't create it. What turned a recession into the Great Depression was policy failures. The Federal Reserve tightened money supply, Hoover insisted on balanced budgets and austerity, and global trade collapsed. Unemployment hit 25%. Bread lines stretched blocks. The Dust Bowl made things worse. The crash was dramatic. Fortunes vanished. Suicides spiked. But it was one domino in a chain, not the whole collapse. Economic crises are systemic, not single event. Yet we love simple explanations, so the crash became the scapegoat. And the man who supposedly fixed it also gets oversimplified. FDR's New Deal forced by unions and critics. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal is framed as his visionary rescue of capitalism. Except he was pushed into it by unions, socialists, and populist critics like Huey Long threatening more radical redistribution. FDR's first instinct was cautious incrementalism. Labor strikes, mass protests, and the very real possibility of revolution forced him to leave. The New Deal included programs like Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, and banking reforms which helped millions. But it didn't end the Depression. World War II did, by employing everyone and ramping up production. The New Deal also excluded many. Domestic and agricultural workers, largely Black and Latino, were left out of Social Security and labor protections due to Southern Democrats' demands. Japanese Americans got internment, not relief. The New Deal was transformative but incomplete, a compromise between capitalism and socialism that saved the former by borrowing from the latter. FDR was pragmatic, not visionary. The real heroes were the workers and organizers who demanded better. And speaking of World War II, its most famous attack has a contested backstory. Pearl Harbor, the surprise that maybe wasn't. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, is taught as a total surprise that dragged a reluctant America into war. Except U.S. intelligence had intercepted Japanese diplomatic codes and knew war was coming. The specific target and timing were unknown, but tensions were sky-high. The U.S. had enacted a crippling oil embargo on Japan in July, strangling their war machine and making conflict nearly inevitable. Some historians argue Roosevelt wanted a provocation to overcome isolationist sentiment, though there's no smoking gun proving he deliberately allowed the attack. What's clear? It wasn't a bolt from the blue. The attack killed over 2,000 Americans, destroyed battleships, and shocked the public. But calling it a complete surprise overstates intelligence failures and ignores the embargo's role in provoking Japan. Wars rarely start from nowhere. They escalate. Pearl Harbor was the culmination of months of brinkmanship. And the war's aftermath included one of America's darkest domestic policies. Internment camps, the security measure that secured nothing. After Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced removal of 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast into internment camps. The justification, military necessity and espionage fears. The reality, racism and hysteria. Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during the war. 2/3 of those interned were U.S. citizens. Families lost homes, businesses, and livelihoods. They were held in remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards for years. Meanwhile, German and Italian Americans faced far less scrutiny despite similar wartime logic. In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, apologizing and paying reparations 46 years later. The Supreme Court upheld internment in Korematsu versus United States in 1944, a decision widely condemned today but never formally overturned. Internment was a grave injustice, not a security measure. Fear doesn't justify violating civil rights. And speaking of wartime myths, even D-Day gets credit it should share. D-Day, the triumph the Soviets made possible. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was a monumental achievement. Allied forces stormed Normandy, opening the Western Front. American textbooks make it sound like the Allies won the war in Europe that day. Except the Soviet Union had been fighting 80% of the German military on the Eastern Front for 3 years. Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, those battles bled the Wehrmacht dry. By the time D-Day happened, the Soviets were already pushing toward Berlin. The Western Allies' delay in opening a second front frustrated Stalin, who suspected they wanted the Soviets and Germans to destroy each other. D-Day mattered enormously for Western Europe's liberation, but the war's outcome was largely decided in the East. The Soviets suffered 27 million deaths, military and civilian. The U.S. lost 400,000. Tragic, but a fraction. Crediting D-Day alone for victory erases the Soviet contribution, which Cold War narratives were happy to do. History is written by victors, but also by geopolitical convenience. The atomic bombs that shared credit for Japan's surrender. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, killed over 200,000 people, and are credited with ending World War II. But Japan's surrender wasn't solely about the bombs. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing Japanese forces. Japan had hoped the Soviets would help negotiate a conditional surrender. That hope evaporated. Facing Soviet invasion from the north and American occupation from the south, Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15. Historians debate whether the bombs or Soviet entry was more decisive. Many Japanese leaders feared Soviet occupation, which would mean no emperor, no negotiated terms, more than American bombs. The U.S. narrative emphasizes the bombs because it justified their use and asserted American dominance in ending the war. Both factors mattered, but erasing the Soviet role oversimplifies and serves Cold War mythology. And speaking of Cold War myths, the doctrines that followed were equally complicated. The Truman Doctrine, the humanitarian mission that backed dictators. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947, pledged U.S. support for free peoples resisting communism. It sounded noble, defending democracy worldwide. In practice, it meant backing anyone anti-communist, regardless of how brutal. In Greece, the U.S. funded the government during a civil war where both sides committed terrible acts, but the right-wing government we supported massacred leftists and imprisoned thousands. Similar patterns followed. Supporting authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East as long as they opposed communism. Dictators like Suharto, Pinochet, and the Shah got American weapons and training. The doctrine wasn't about freedom. It was about containing Soviet influence by any means. The moral language masked realpolitik. Truman's speech framed the Cold War as a battle between freedom and tyranny, but American foreign policy often chose the latter when convenient. And that pattern continued into the next forgotten war. The Korean War, the police action that killed 36,000 Americans. The Korean War, 1950–53, gets called a police action because Congress never declared war. Tell that to the 36,000 Americans who died or the millions of Koreans killed. North Korea, backed by China and the Soviets, invaded South Korea. The U.S., under UN authorization, intervened. General MacArthur pushed north. Then China entered, pushing back. The war stalemated near the original border, the 38th parallel. An armistice in July 1953 ended fighting but never officially ended the war. No peace treaty was signed. Korea remains divided. The war devastated the peninsula. Cities flattened, civilians massacred by both sides, families separated. Calling it a police action minimized its horror and sidestepped constitutional questions about presidential war powers. It set a precedent. Presidents could wage war without congressional approval by calling it something else. The pattern repeated in Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. Korea wasn't a footnote. It was a brutal, unresolved conflict that still shapes geopolitics today. And back home, another conflict was destroying lives without bombs. McCarthyism, the witch hunt that found few witches. Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade from 1950 to 54 ruined thousands of lives based on flimsy accusations. Actors, writers, teachers, government employees blacklisted, fired, or imprisoned for alleged communist ties. McCarthy waived lists of supposed communists in the State Department but never proved claims. The House Un-American Activities Committee forced people to name names or face contempt charges. Careers ended. Suicides followed. The Red Scare was hysteria, not security. Venona decrypts, Soviet cables decoded after the Cold War, showed some espionage did occur, but McCarthy's targets were mostly innocent. His downfall came in 1954 when he accused the army of harboring communists and was censured by the Senate. But the damage was done. Civil liberties trampled, lives destroyed, fear institutionalized. McCarthyism became shorthand for paranoid overreach. Yet textbooks soften it into a regrettable episode, not state-sponsored terror against dissenters. And while McCarthy hunted imaginary enemies, real battles for civil rights were beginning. Brown versus Board, the decision that didn't integrate schools. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional, a landmark, yes. But schools didn't integrate overnight or even in the next decade. The court's follow-up ruling, Brown 2, said integration should happen with all deliberate speed, which Southern states interpreted as never. Massive resistance followed. Virginia closed public schools rather than integrate. Arkansas's governor used the National Guard to block black students from Little Rock Central High in 1957 until Eisenhower federalized the Guard. Many districts didn't meaningfully integrate until the 1970s after federal courts ordered busing. Some still haven't. White flight to suburbs and private schools resegregated education. Brown mattered symbolically and legally, sparking the civil rights movement. But calling it the moment schools integrated is fantasy. The decision was a beginning, not an ending. Integration required decades of litigation, activism, and federal enforcement. One Supreme Court case doesn't undo centuries of structural racism. And the president during Brown had his own complicated relationship with military power. Eisenhower's military-industrial warning that came too late. President Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address in January 1961 warned against the military-industrial complex, the cozy relationship between defense contractors, the Pentagon, and Congress. It was treated as a prophetic denunciation. Except Eisenhower spent 8 years expanding that very complex. Defense spending soared under him. The Cold War arms race intensified. He approved covert operations overthrowing governments in Iran and Guatemala. His warning was real but mild and late. He didn't dismantle the system. He handed it to Kennedy bigger than he found it. The speech was Eisenhower's attempt at legacy management, acknowledging a problem he helped create. The military-industrial complex didn't slow after his warning. It accelerated through Vietnam, the Reagan buildup, and the War on Terror. Eisenhower's words are quoted respectfully, but they changed nothing. Warnings without action are just footnotes. And speaking of Cold War competitions that mix politics with science, the space race built on Nazi engineering. The space race wasn't just about science and exploration. It was Cold War propaganda. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in October 1957, Americans panicked about falling behind. The U.S. responded by pouring money into NASA, which relied heavily on Wernher von Braun and other former Nazi rocket scientists brought to America via Operation Paperclip after World War II. Von Braun had built V-2 rockets using slave labor at Nazi concentration camps where thousands died. The U.S. overlooked his past because he was useful. The space program was about demonstrating technological and ideological superiority, not purely scientific curiosity. Landing on the moon in 1969 was an incredible achievement and required genuine brilliance. But it was also a very expensive flex to show the Soviets we could. Both superpowers used space as a battlefield for prestige. The sanitized version celebrates astronauts and engineers. The full story includes Nazis, propaganda, and geopolitical one-upmanship. But that complexity might keep you awake, and we're trying to avoid that. Rosa Parks, the tired seamstress who wasn't spontaneous. Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her bus seat on December 1, 1955, gets taught as a spontaneous act by a tired seamstress. Except Parks was a trained NAACP activist who'd attended organizing workshops at the Highlander Folk School. She was secretary of the Montgomery NAACP and had been involved in civil rights work for over a decade. The Montgomery bus boycott was a planned test case. Civil rights leaders had been waiting for the right plaintiff. Earlier that year, 15-year-old Claudette Cole then was arrested for the same refusal, but organizers decided she wasn't the ideal face for the movement because she was pregnant and unmarried. Parks was respectable, poised, and experienced. Her arrest wasn't impulsive. It was strategic civil disobedience. The tired seamstress narrative made her relatable but erased her agency and political skill. Parks was a deliberate activist, not an accidental hero. Calling it spontaneous diminishes the years of organizing behind that moment. And speaking of sanitized narratives about civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., the nonviolent icon who armed himself. Martin Luther King Jr. is synonymous with nonviolence, and his commitment to it was genuine and transformative. But early in the Montgomery boycott, King kept guns in his home for protection. His house was firebombed. Threats were constant. He applied for a concealed carry permit in 1956 and was denied. Over time, he embraced strict nonviolence philosophically, influenced by Gandhi and his own Christian faith. But textbooks erase his evolution, presenting him as always pacifist. They also ignore that he was increasingly radical before his assassination, criticizing capitalism, opposing the Vietnam War, organizing the Poor People's Campaign. The FBI surveilled him, calling him the most dangerous Negro in America. His 1967 speech condemning Vietnam was widely criticized, even by allies. The sanitized king is the "I have a dream" speech on the National Mall. The real king challenged systemic injustice and was far more controversial. History prefers the palatable version. And speaking of moments that required federal force, not peaceful progress, Little Rock 9, when troops were needed to integrate. The Little Rock 9 integrating Central High School in September 1957 wasn't a gentle transition. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus deployed the National Guard to block 9 black students from entering, defying the Supreme Court's Brown decision. Mobs of white protesters screamed threats and slurs. Elizabeth Eckford, separated from the group, walked alone through the gauntlet while photographers captured her dignity against hatred. President Eisenhower, reluctant to intervene, finally federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne Division 1,000 troops to protect the students. Even with military escort, the 9 faced daily harassment, violence, and isolation inside the school. One, Minnie Jean Brown, was expelled for fighting back against attacks. The next year, Faubus closed all Little Rock high schools rather than integrate. An entire year lost. Little Rock wasn't peaceful progress. It was forced integration requiring federal troops. The images shocked the world and exposed American hypocrisy. But images from another war would soon do the same. Vietnam, the domino that never fell. The Vietnam War was justified by the domino theory. If Vietnam fell to communism, all Southeast Asia would follow. Except after Vietnam fell in 1975, the dominoes didn't tumble. Laos and Cambodia went communist, but Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines didn't. The theory was flawed propaganda. The war's justification was also built on lies. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, where North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked U.S. destroyers, was exaggerated. The first attack was unclear. The second probably didn't happen. Sonar operators misread signals in rough seas. But President Johnson used it to get Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him war powers without a declaration. 58,000 Americans died along with millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians. The war devastated a region, traumatized a generation, and accomplished nothing strategically. No dominoes fell. But the lies that started the war were exposed, fueling distrust that shaped the next scandal. Watergate, the scandal that was bigger than Nixon. Watergate is shorthand for Nixon's crimes, but it involved a sprawling Republican conspiracy. The committee to re-elect the president, CREEP, funded a slush fund for dirty tricks, including the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in June 1972. When caught, the White House orchestrated a cover-up. Hush money to burglars, destruction of evidence, perjury, obstruction of justice. Nixon's tapes revealed he knew and approved. But it wasn't just him. Attorney General John Mitchell, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, Domestic Advisor John Ehrlichman, and dozens of others were implicated. 48 people were convicted. The scandal exposed systemic corruption, abuse of power, and contempt for democracy. Nixon resigned in August 1974 to avoid impeachment. The myth that he was a lone bad actor lets the GOP off easy. Watergate was institutional rot. Yet the lessons didn't stick. Future administrations found new ways to abuse power. And speaking of institutional battles, another constitutional amendment also faced organized resistance. The ERA was defeated by more than one woman. The Equal Rights Amendment, passed by Congress in 1972, needed approval by 38 states. It stalled at 35, failing in 1982. Phyllis Schlafly gets blamed or credited, depending on perspective, for leading opposition with apocalyptic warnings about gender-neutral bathrooms and women in combat. But corporate interests also fought it, fearing equal pay mandates and benefits costs. Insurance companies, the Chamber of Commerce, and conservative religious groups funded campaigns against it. Some unions opposed it, worried it would eliminate protective labor laws for women. Southern states resisted as part of broader backlash against federal civil rights enforcement. Schlafly was the visible face, but the opposition was well-funded and multifaceted. The ERA's failure wasn't one activist's doing. It was structural resistance to gender equality embedded in political and economic systems. The amendment remains unratified, though states continue debating it. Meanwhile, another scandal showed presidential power could evade constitutional oversight entirely. Iran-Contra, the rogue operation that Reagan approved. The Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s gets framed as a rogue operation by overzealous aides. Except President Reagan approved it. The scheme: sell weapons to Iran despite an arms embargo and Iran holding American hostages, and use the profits to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua despite Congress explicitly banning aid via the Boland Amendment. National Security Advisor John Poindexter and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North ran the operation, shredded documents when exposed, and took the fall. Reagan claimed ignorance, but his own diaries and notes suggest otherwise. 14 people were indicted, 11 convicted. President George H.W. Bush later pardoned 6, including Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, whose trial might have implicated Bush himself. The scandal revealed contempt for congressional oversight and the Constitution. Reagan's popularity survived because he played the forgetful grandfather and the media moved on. Iran-Contra should have been as damaging as Watergate but became a footnote. And speaking of moments where the narrative oversimplified the cause, the Berlin Wall, which Reagan's speech didn't topple. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Ronald Reagan's June 1987 speech in Berlin is credited with ending the Cold War. Except the wall fell in November 1989 because of Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, and relentless pressure from East German protesters. Gorbachev refused to use Soviet troops to crush dissent, breaking from past Soviet leaders. East Germans protested for months, demanding freedom to travel. A bureaucratic miscommunication during a press conference led officials to announce border openings immediately, and crowds surged to checkpoints. Guards, overwhelmed and lacking orders to shoot, let them through. Reagan's speech was stirring rhetoric, but it didn't cause the wall's fall. Gorbachev's willingness to let Eastern Europe go and grassroots movements forcing change did. Giving it all to one speech is Cold War triumphalism. The wall came down despite Reagan's military buildup, not because of it. And the next major conflict also had a cleaner narrative than reality. The Gulf War's clean victory that wasn't. The Gulf War of 1991 is remembered as a quick, decisive victory with minimal American casualties. Operation Desert Storm liberated Kuwait from Iraqi occupation in 6 weeks. But the clean war had dark moments. The highway of death, the road from Kuwait City to Basra, became a slaughter as retreating Iraqi forces, along with civilians and stolen goods, were bombed relentlessly by coalition aircraft. Estimates of Iraqi dead range from thousands to tens of thousands. Photos showed charred vehicles and bodies, raising questions about whether it was military necessity or overkill. The U.S. also used depleted uranium munitions, which left radioactive contamination linked to birth defects and cancers in Iraq and illnesses in veterans. The war was sold as a triumph of precision bombing and international coalition, but precision doesn't mean bloodless. Civilian infrastructure was destroyed, leading to post-war deaths from disease and starvation. The war was quick, not clean. And speaking of political battles framed misleadingly, Clinton's impeachment, which was always about politics. Bill Clinton's impeachment in 1998 gets framed as about perjury, lying under oath about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Legally, that was the charge. Politically, it was partisan revenge. Independent counsel Ken Starr's investigation started with Whitewater real estate dealings, found nothing, then pivoted to Lewinsky. The affair was consensual but involved a massive power imbalance. Clinton was president. Lewinsky, a 22-year-old intern. He lied in a deposition for Paula Jones's sexual harassment lawsuit, which was later dismissed. The House impeached him on perjury and obstruction charges. The Senate acquitted him in February 1999. No Republican voted to convict on perjury, and only 5 Republicans joined Democrats on obstruction. Public opinion favored Clinton. His approval ratings stayed high. The impeachment was politically motivated, using personal misconduct to undo an election. It set precedents for partisan impeachment, weaponizing the process. The affair was wrong. The impeachment was theater. And the next national tragedy had its own uncomfortable truths. 9/11, the intelligence failure that was also ignored warnings. The September 11, 2001 attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and were called a catastrophic intelligence failure. True, but also incomplete. The CIA and FBI had warnings. The August 6, 2001 presidential daily brief titled, "Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S." The FBI's Phoenix memo warned about suspicious flight school students. The CIA tracked 2 hijackers to the U.S. but didn't tell the FBI. Failures of communication and imagination allowed the plot to succeed. But there's more. The 9/11 Commission report redacted 28 pages about Saudi connections until 2016 when they were partially released, revealing Saudi officials had contact with hijackers. 15 of 19 hijackers were Saudi. Yet Saudi Arabia faced no consequences. Oil and geopolitical alliances mattered more. The attacks were preventable with better coordination and attention. Calling it purely an intelligence failure obscures ignored warnings and uncomfortable alliances. And those attacks justified the next great lie. Iraq's WMDs that never existed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was sold on the certainty that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented evidence to the UN. Aluminum tubes, mobile bioweapon labs, yellow cake uranium from Niger. All false. The aluminum tubes were for rockets, not centrifuges. The mobile labs didn't exist. The yellow cake documents were forgeries. UN inspectors found nothing before the invasion, but the Bush administration dismissed them. The war happened anyway. No WMDs were ever found. Over 4,000 U.S. troops died along with hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. The war destabilized the region, created ISIS, and cost trillions. Intelligence was cherry-picked and exaggerated to justify a predetermined decision. It was the Iraq War's Gulf of Tonkin, a lie to start a war. Some officials claimed they believed in bad intelligence. Others knowingly misled. Either way, the consequences were catastrophic. And years later, another policy fight got similarly misrepresented. Obamacare, the socialist takeover that kept private insurance. The Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010, was attacked as a socialist government takeover of healthcare. Except it was designed around private insurance. The individual mandate requiring people to buy insurance came from conservative think tanks. Mitt Romney implemented a nearly identical plan in Massachusetts as governor. Obamacare expanded Medicaid, created insurance exchanges, and prohibited denying coverage for pre-existing conditions. But it didn't create a public option or single-payer system. Insurance and pharmaceutical companies remained central and profitable. The law helped millions get coverage. 20 million gained insurance. But it also had flaws. High deductibles, narrow networks, and costs still burdensome for many. Calling it socialist was political exaggeration. It was a centrist, market-based reform that Democrats compromised rightward to pass with no Republican votes. The backlash wasn't about policy details. It was ideological opposition to any expansion of the government's role in healthcare. The real debate was never honestly framed. But going back further, even the founding fathers' relationship with slavery gets whitewashed. The founders who protected slavery did not end it. The Constitution is taught as a freedom document, but it protected slavery explicitly. Article 1, Section 9 prohibited Congress from banning the slave trade until 1808, a 20-year grace period demanded by Southern states. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people for representation, boosting Southern power. The Fugitive Slave Clause required the return of escapees. Many founders owned enslaved people. George Washington owned over 300 throughout his life and only freed them in his will after his death. And even then, only his own, not those his wife brought to the marriage. Thomas Jefferson owned over 600, fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman, and freed only a handful. The founders knew slavery was evil. Some said so, but they chose political unity over justice. They didn't end it. They made it stronger, pushing abolition to future generations. The sanitized narrative that they were all conflicted but noble ignores that they chose power and property over principle. And speaking of historical narratives that are shorter than their legends, the Pony Express, which lasted barely over a year. The Pony Express is iconic. Rugged riders galloping across the frontier, delivering mail through blizzards and bandit attacks. Romantic, sure. It also lasted only 18 months. It started in April 1860 and ended in October 1861, killed by the transcontinental telegraph. The Pony Express was a financial disaster. Fast but expensive, losing money. Constantly. It was a publicity stunt by a freight company trying to win a government mail contract, which they never got. Riders did cover nearly 2,000 miles in about 10 days. A remarkable feat, but it was never profitable or sustainable. The telegraph sent messages instantly for a fraction of the cost. The Pony Express became legendary because it fit the frontier mythology. Individual grit conquering wilderness, even though it was a failed business venture. Its brevity doesn't diminish the rider's courage, but the myth vastly overstates its importance. And speaking of myths that inflate small details, Lincoln's beard, the campaign gimmick disguised as advice. The story goes, 11-year-old Grace Bedell wrote to Abraham Lincoln suggesting he grow a beard to improve his appearance, and he took her advice. Sweet, humanizing, partly true. Bedell did write in October 1860, and Lincoln did grow a beard soon after and met her on a campaign stop. But beards were becoming fashionable among politicians and military men. Photographs were increasingly important, and advisors thought a beard made Lincoln look more dignified and less gaunt. The Bedell letter was convenient. A charming story that made the decision seem spontaneous and humble, not calculated image management. Lincoln was a savvy politician who understood optics. The beard became iconic after his assassination, cementing his martyred image. The letter exists so the story has truth. But it wasn't the sole reason. Political image-making is rarely that simple. And speaking of myths built around symbolic gestures that never happened, the bra burning that was just a slogan. The feminist protesters at the 1968 Miss America pageant supposedly burned bras, creating an enduring image of radical feminism. Except no bras were burned. Protesters threw bras, girdles, high heels, and makeup into a freedom trash can to symbolize rejecting restrictive beauty standards. They wanted to set it on fire but couldn't get a permit, so nothing burned. A reporter compared the protest to Vietnam draft card burnings, and the bra-burning feminist myth was born. It stuck because it was easy to mock, turning legitimate critiques of sexism into a punchline. The protest had serious goals: challenging objectification, racism in beauty standards, and corporate exploitation. But the non-existent fire became the story. Symbols matter, but this one was invented by dismissive media coverage, not activists. The phrase still gets used to trivialize feminism decades later. And speaking of enduring myths that oversimplify and mislead, Columbus, who didn't prove the earth was round. Christopher Columbus didn't prove the earth was round. That was known since ancient Greece. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference in 240 BC with remarkable accuracy. Educated Europeans in Columbus's time knew the Earth was spherical. Columbus's error was miscalculating its size. He thought Asia was much closer than it was, which is why he sought funding. Most experts correctly told him he'd run out of supplies before reaching Asia. He got lucky that the Americas were in between, though he died believing he'd reached the Indies. The flat Earth myth was invented in the 1800s to make Columbus a visionary battling ignorance, which fit Enlightenment narratives. This historical fiction, not fact. Columbus was a skilled navigator and brutal colonizer, but he didn't overturn cosmology. He was wrong about geography and stumbled into a hemisphere already inhabited by millions. And speaking of encounters between Europeans and Native Americans that get romanticized, Thanksgiving, the harmony meal that covered a massacre. The first Thanksgiving in 1621 between Pilgrims and the Wampanoag is taught as harmonious cooperation. The reality, a tense temporary alliance. The Wampanoag, led by Massasoit, were recovering from disease epidemics brought by earlier European contact that had killed up to 90% of their population. They allied with the weak, struggling Pilgrims for strategic reasons: access to guns and protection from rival tribes. The 1621 harvest celebration was a survival pact, not a friendship feast. By 1637, Puritans in Connecticut were massacring Pequot villagers, burning them alive, and celebrating it with a day of Thanksgiving. Massachusetts Bay Colony Governor John Winthrop declared such days after successful slaughters of native people. The Thanksgiving myth erases genocide. The holiday became official in 1863 under Lincoln as a unifying Civil War measure. The Pilgrim story was layered on later, sanitizing brutal colonization into feel-good folklore. And speaking of sanitized folklore involving Native Americans, Pocahontas, the child whose story became romance. Pocahontas saving John Smith by throwing herself over him as her father prepared to execute him is American legend. Except Pocahontas' real name Matoka was around 12 years old when they met in 1607. Smith wrote about the rescue years later, and historians doubt it happened as described. It may have been a ritual adoption ceremony misunderstood by Smith or embellishment for his published narrative. There was no romance. Pocahontas was kidnapped by English settlers in 1613, held hostage, converted to Christianity, renamed Rebecca, and married to John Rolfe, likely not by choice. She was paraded around London as a civilized savage for propaganda, then died at around 21, possibly from disease, while preparing to return to Virginia. Her story is tragedy and exploitation, not a love story. Disney and popular culture turned her into a romantic heroine, erasing her lack of agency and the violence of colonization. The real story is about a child caught between worlds, used as a political pawn, and dying far from home. Manhattan, the island that was never sold for $24. The story goes that in 1626, Dutch colonists bought Manhattan from Native Americans for $24 worth of beads and trinkets, a laughable bargain, proof of native naivete. Except that's not what happened. First, the $24 figure was calculated centuries later by a historian converting 60 guilders based on questionable exchange rates. Second, the Lenape people who made the agreement likely understood it as permission to share the land temporarily, not a permanent sale. Land ownership as Europeans conceived it, exclusive, permanent, transferable, didn't exist in Lenape culture. Land was communal, used seasonally. The purchase was a fundamental misunderstanding, possibly deliberate on the Dutch side. The Lenape kept using Manhattan and were later violently expelled when colonists decided they owned it outright. It wasn't a sale. It was a treaty misinterpreted and weaponized. Calling it a purchase for beads makes the Lenape look foolish when really it was colonial fraud. And speaking of violent expulsions disguised with softer language, the Trail of Tears that was forced, not voluntary. The Trail of Tears gets softened with passive language like removal or relocation, implying choice. There was none. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced approximately 15,000 Cherokee from their ancestral lands in Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The forced march in 1838 and 39 covered over 1,000 miles. Families traveled in winter with inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. Disease, starvation, and exposure killed roughly 4,000 Cherokee, nearly a quarter of those removed. Soldiers herded them like livestock. The Cherokee had fought removal legally, winning in the Supreme Court, but Jackson ignored the ruling. Other tribes, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, suffered similar forced removals with comparable death tolls. It wasn't a migration. It was ethnic cleansing. The Trail of Tears is a scar on American history, and calling it anything less than forced genocide is dishonest. And forced removal wasn't limited to indigenous peoples. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first U.S. law banning immigration based on nationality. It was supposed to be temporary, 10 years, to protect white workers from unfair competition. It lasted 61 years until 1943, and only ended because China was a World War II ally and the law became embarrassing. The act barred Chinese laborers, denied citizenship to Chinese immigrants, and separated families for decades. It birthed the immigration quota system, setting precedents for later exclusions of Japanese, Indians, and others. The law was rooted in racism. Chinese immigrants were scapegoated for economic problems despite building the Transcontinental Railroad and working jobs white Americans wouldn't. The Exclusion Act wasn't an aberration. It was policy shaping immigration law for generations. When it was repealed, the annual quota for Chinese immigrants was set at 105. Token inclusion, not justice. And immigration wasn't the only issue where American intervention had lasting consequences abroad. The Spanish-American War that didn't free Cuba. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was sold as liberating Cuba from Spanish tyranny. Remember Maine? Americans cried after the battleship exploded in Havana Harbor, though the cause was likely an accident, not Spanish sabotage. The U.S. won quickly and Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. But Cuba wasn't freed. The Platt Amendment of 1901 forced Cuba to grant the U.S. a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, allow American intervention in Cuban affairs, and limit treaties with other nations. Cuba became a U.S. puppet state, not an independent republic. American companies dominated Cuban sugar, utilities, and land. The amendment wasn't repealed until 1934, and even then, Guantanamo remained American. The war wasn't about freedom. It was about replacing one empire with another. Cuba traded Spanish colonialism for American neocolonialism. And speaking of iconic American symbols with misleading stories, Ford's Model T, available in any color as long as it's a lie. Henry Ford's famous quip, "Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants so long as it is black," is treated as historical fact. Except early Model Ts from 1908 to 1914 came in multiple colors. Green, red, blue, gray. Black became standard from 1914 to 1925 because black enamel dried faster, speeding production. Ford prioritized efficiency over choice, which fit his assembly line philosophy. By 1926, competition forced him to offer colors again. The quote itself probably came from Ford's 1922 autobiography, written to reinforce his image as a no-nonsense industrialist. It became a myth because it fit his brand: efficiency, simplicity, mass production. But it wasn't accurate. Early buyers had options. The black-only period was a manufacturing decision, not a founding principle. And speaking of policies sold as practical but driven by other motives, prohibition, the economic disaster sold as moral victory. Prohibition was supposed to reduce crime and improve public health. Instead, it cost the federal government roughly $500 million in lost tax revenue annually while creating a massive criminal enterprise. Organized crime syndicates led by figures like Al Capone made fortunes bootlegging. Speakeasies spread. Enforcement was inconsistent and corrupt. The government poisoned industrial alcohol to deter drinking, killing over 10,000 people. Prohibition didn't stop drinking. It made it more dangerous and enriched criminals. The policy was rooted in nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment, targeting German brewers and Irish and Italian communities. When it was repealed in 1933, it was an admission of failure. The economic argument restoring alcohol taxes during the Depression helped end it. Prohibition is taught as a misguided experiment, but it was a deadly, discriminatory policy that wasted resources and lives. The lesson, bans create black markets, hasn't stopped similar approaches to drug policy. And speaking of wartime contributions that get misrepresented, the Tuskegee Airmen, heroic but not the first. The Tuskegee Airmen, the first black military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces, are rightly celebrated. They trained at Tuskegee, Alabama during World War II, flew over 1,500 missions, and earned numerous distinctions. Their success challenged racist assumptions about black competence and courage. But they weren't the first black pilots. Eugene Bullard, a black American, flew for France in World War I because the U.S. military wouldn't let him. Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license in 1921, also in France, because American schools refused her. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first in the segregated U.S. military, a shameful qualifier. Their heroism is undeniable, but the narrative erases earlier pioneers and the racism that delayed integration. The military didn't desegregate until 1948 under Truman's Executive Order 9981. The Tuskegee Airmen fought 2 wars. One against the Axis, one against American racism. And speaking of military operations undermined by internal failures, the Bay of Pigs, planned before Kennedy took office. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 gets blamed on President John F. Kennedy's inexperience. But the operation was planned under Eisenhower, and the CIA was already training Cuban exiles when Kennedy inherited it. Kennedy had doubts but approved the invasion 3 months into his presidency, trusting CIA assurances. The plan was poorly conceived. 1,500 exiles were supposed to spark a popular uprising against Castro. It didn't happen. Cuban forces crushed the invasion within 3 days. Air support was inadequate. The CIA underestimated Castro's military. Over 100 exiles died. Nearly 1,200 were captured. Kennedy took public responsibility. Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. But privately blamed the CIA. The disaster taught him to distrust military and intelligence advisors, shaping his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs wasn't Kennedy's plan, but it was his failure to question bad advice. And speaking of presidents who claimed popular mandates they didn't quite have, Nixon's silent majority drowned out by protests. Richard Nixon invoked the silent majority in a November 1969 speech, claiming most Americans supported his Vietnam policies despite vocal protests. It was effective rhetoric positioning dissenters as a loud minority. But Vietnam protests were massive. The moratorium in October 1969 drew millions nationwide. The November 15, 1969 March on Washington brought 500,000. Protests weren't fringe. They were mainstream. Nixon's 1972 landslide victory, winning 49 states, is cited as proof the silent majority existed. Except that election was tainted by Watergate crimes. The break-in, campaign finance violations, dirty tricks. Nixon's team sabotaged opponents and broke laws to win. His mandate was built on fraud. The protests were real. The silent majority was a talking point to dismiss them. Public opinion on Vietnam was divided, shifting, and complex, not silently supportive. And speaking of leaders credited with ending conflicts they didn't start or control, Reagan's Cold War victory that Gorbachev delivered. Ronald Reagan gets credit for winning the Cold War with military pressure and tough rhetoric. Except the Soviet Union collapsed primarily because of internal failures and Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. The Soviet economy was stagnant, unable to keep pace with the arms race or provide for its people. Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, trying to save the system. Instead, it unraveled. Eastern European nations broke free. The Berlin Wall fell. Soviet republics declared independence. Reagan's military buildup may have accelerated Soviet economic strain, but the USSR was already failing. Gorbachev chose not to use force to hold the empire together, a choice Reagan didn't control. Attributing the Cold War's end solely to Reagan is American triumphalism that ignores Soviet agency and internal dynamics. Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. Reagan's role was significant but not singular. And going back further, the foundations of American expansion involved deliberate violence, often mislabeled as accidental. The native genocide that was deliberate policy. Native American population collapse is often blamed on diseases Europeans unintentionally brought. While disease killed millions, smallpox, measles, typhus, some spread was deliberate. In 1763, British officers discussed distributing smallpox-infected blankets to hostile tribes during Pontiac's rebellion. Letters between Colonel Henry Bouquet and General Jeffrey Amherst confirmed the plan. Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes? Amherst replied approvingly. Whether it was executed and effective is debated, but the intent was biological warfare. Beyond disease, U.S. policy included forced removals, massacres, starvation campaigns, and cultural destruction. California's state government funded militias that exterminated Native people in the 1850s. The federal government broke treaties, confined tribes to reservations, and forcibly assimilated children in boarding schools. Native population in what's now the U.S. dropped from millions to under 250,000 by 1900. It wasn't accidental. It was systematic genocide. And while Americans were expanding westward, another tragedy was unfolding across the Atlantic. The Irish famine, where America helped but Britain exported food. The Irish potato famine from 1845 to 1852 killed over 1 million people and forced another million to immigrate. Many to the U.S. Americans did send aid, roughly $170,000. A significant sum then, along with ships of food. But Britain, which controlled Ireland, continued exporting food from Ireland during the famine. Grain, cattle, and other crops were shipped to England while Irish people starved. British policy prioritized free market economics and blamed Irish laziness. Aid efforts were inadequate and conditional, often requiring conversion to Protestantism. The famine was a natural disaster, potato blight, made worse by British colonial exploitation and indifference. Ireland's population still hasn't recovered to pre-famine levels. American aid helped, but the story is really about how colonial policy turned crop failure into mass death. And colonial violence in North America reached another horrifying peak at the century's end. Wounded Knee, the massacre called a battle. The Wounded Knee massacre on December 29, 1890, is sometimes called a battle, implying two-sided combat. It was a slaughter. U.S. 7th Cavalry troops, the same regiment Custer led at Little Bighorn, surrounded a Lakota camp near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. They were disarming the Lakota, who were fleeing after the Ghost Dance movement spooked white settlers and authorities. A gun discharged, accidentally or deliberately unclear, and soldiers opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns, a rapid-fire artillery weapon. Approximately 300 Lakota died, mostly women, children, and elderly. Bodies were found miles away, people shot while fleeing. 25 soldiers died, many from friendly fire. 20 soldiers later received Medals of Honor, a grotesque recognition of a massacre. Wounded Knee wasn't combat. It was the brutal conclusion of the Indian Wars, a final assertion of dominance over a defeated, starving people. And decades later, another marginalized group faced state-sanctioned violence in American cities. The Zoot Suit riots. In Los Angeles in June 1943, what are often described as spontaneous clashes between sailors and Mexican-American youth were actually organized racist attacks. White servicemen, sailors and soldiers on leave, roamed Los Angeles beating Mexican-American teenagers, stripping them of their zoot suits, which were seen as unpatriotic because they used excess fabric during wartime rationing. The attacks targeted Black and Filipino youth too. Police largely stood by or arrested the victims. The press blamed Mexican-American gangs and hoodlums. The riots were fueled by wartime xenophobia, economic competition, and racism. Zoot suits were cultural expressions, and the violence was an assertion of white dominance. The riots ended when military officials declared Los Angeles off-limits to personnel, not because police restored order. The city banned zoot suits afterward. The riots were racial terror, not random violence. And after the war, another policy promised equity but delivered discrimination. The GI Bill that redlined Black veterans. The GI. The Bill of 1944 offered veterans college tuition, job training, and low-interest home loans. It's credited with creating the middle class for white veterans, yes. For Black veterans, the bill's benefits were systematically denied. Southern universities refused Black students. VA administrators, often racist locals, steered Black veterans toward vocational training instead of college. Housing loans were denied because of redlining policies that declared Black neighborhoods too risky for investment. Suburban developments explicitly excluded Black families through restrictive covenants. So while white veterans bought homes in booming suburbs, building generational wealth, Black veterans were locked out. The wealth gap created by the GI Bill's discriminatory implementation persists today. The bill wasn't inherently racist, but its execution was enabled by local control and federal indifference. Equity on paper doesn't mean equity in practice. And speaking of resistance movements whose origins get simplified, Stonewall, preceded by years of LGBTQ resistance. The Stonewall riots in June 1969 are taught as the birth of the gay rights movement. They were pivotal, yes. A multi-day uprising after police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York. Patrons, including transgender women of color like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, fought back. It galvanized activism and led to the first Pride marches. But LGBTQ resistance preceded Stonewall. The Compton's cafeteria riot in San Francisco in 1966 saw transgender women and drag queens fighting police harassment. The Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis organized in the 1950s. Annual pickets at Independence Hall in Philadelphia occurred from 1965 to 69. Stonewall mattered because it sustained, visible, and radicalized a generation. But it wasn't the first act of resistance. The movement had roots. Centering Stonewall erases earlier activists, particularly transgender people of color who led but are often forgotten. And their struggle for recognition continued through another crisis largely ignored by those in power. The AIDS crisis, ignored while 20,000 died. The AIDS epidemic began in the early 1980s, but President Ronald Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS until September 1985, 4 years into the crisis. By then, over 20,000 Americans had died. His administration slashed public health funding, blocked educational campaigns, and refused to treat AIDS as a public health emergency because it primarily affected gay men, whom many officials viewed with contempt. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop wanted aggressive education. The White House blocked him. Activists like ACT UP had to force action through protests and civil disobedience. Research funding was delayed. People died from a disease the government ignored out of homophobia. Reagan's press secretary joked about AIDS in briefings. The death toll reached hundreds of thousands before effective treatments emerged in the mid-1990s. The Reagan administration's neglect was policy, not ignorance. Thousands of preventable deaths resulted. And while some historical injustices eventually get acknowledged, others remain celebrated. Columbus Day, honoring genocide. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1937, celebrating Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1492. But Columbus's legacy is genocide. The Taino people of the Caribbean, who greeted Columbus peacefully, were enslaved, worked to death, and decimated by disease. Columbus's own journals describe cutting off hands of Taino who didn't meet gold quotas. Within decades, the Taino population dropped from hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, to near extinction. Columbus initiated the transatlantic slave trade, shipping enslaved people to Spain. He wasn't an explorer discovering an empty land. He was a colonizer who enslaved and slaughtered indigenous peoples. The holiday was promoted by Italian-American groups seeking recognition, which is understandable. But honoring Columbus specifically is indefensible. Some places now celebrate Indigenous Peoples' Day instead. History should acknowledge Columbus's navigation skills and his catastrophic impact. Calling him a hero erases millions of deaths. And his voyages began centuries of American policies built on similar disregard for human rights abroad. America's defense of democracy, unless it threatened corporate interests. The U.S. claims to defend democracy globally, but history shows otherwise when democracy threatened American economic or strategic interests. In 1953, the CIA helped overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized oil, threatening British and American oil companies. The U.S. installed the authoritarian Shah, whose brutality fueled the 1979 revolution. In 1973, the CIA supported a coup against Chile's elected socialist president Salvador Allende, installing dictator Augusto Pinochet, whose regime murdered thousands. Similar interventions occurred in Guatemala, Congo, Indonesia, and elsewhere. The pattern: democratically elected leaders who threatened corporate profits or adopted leftist policies were overthrown, often replaced by dictators friendly to U.S. interests. American foreign policy prioritized capitalism and geopolitical power over democracy. The rhetoric was freedom. The reality was the empire. And that gap between rhetoric and reality defines much of American history, which brings us to the final myth. History has progressed when regression is always possible. The most dangerous myth is that history moves inevitably toward justice and equality, that each generation is more enlightened than the last. It's comforting but false. Progress isn't linear. is contested and reversible. Reconstruction advanced civil rights, then was abandoned. The Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder, leading to new voter suppression laws. Women's suffrage was won in 1920, but reproductive rights are under constant attack. Labor won protections in the 1930s. Union power has since collapsed. Environmental regulations strengthened, then were rolled back. Rights aren't permanent. They're defended generation after generation. Assuming progress is automatic breeds complacency. History shows that without vigilance and activism, gains can disappear. The arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own. People have to bend it constantly against resistance. That's the real lesson. Progress requires work, and regression is always one election, one court decision, one crisis away. Sleep well, knowing nothing is guaranteed. History isn't finished with us yet. And that brings us to the end of our little journey through American mythology and the Messier reality underneath. 100 lies, 100 corrections, and probably a few uncomfortable truths that'll make Thanksgiving dinner a little awkward if you bring them up. But here's the thing. History isn't a bedtime story with a moral at the end. It's a long, complicated, confusing argument between people trying to figure out how to live together without destroying each other, and sometimes failing spectacularly. The lies we tell about it don't make us stronger. They make us weak, unprepared for the actual work of building something better. So the next time someone tells you America has always been exceptional, or that the founders were flawless visionaries, or that progress is inevitable and permanent, just remember. Someone once thought prohibition would end crime, Columbus proved the earth was round, and giving smallpox blankets to indigenous people was acceptable military strategy. History is written by the winners, edited by the comfortable, and sold to children as inspiration. But you're not a child anymore. Sleep well, knowing that the truth, however uncomfortable, is always more interesting than the myth. And hey, at least you didn't have to wear fake teeth made from someone else's teeth.